Well, good evening. Oh, can you guys talk to me? All right. Good evening. It is, man, I come here with real mixed emotions because I'm so grateful to be with you all, and I'm so excited to be here. But we've been in South Africa. My wife and I have been in South Africa for almost 3 weeks, and we leave tomorrow. We're so bummed. Everybody has just been so amazing, so warm, so hospitable, and the staff here at the church have just, I mean, it's just been incredible, the hospitality you've shown. And so we're really, really grateful. And can't say it enough, and I can't thank you enough, but appreciate you all including us in your community's rhythm. Appreciate you just extending such love and embrace to us. It's really a gift, and it's really healing for us. My wife and I travel a lot, actually. We travel all around the world frequently, and we interact with a lot of worshiping and a lot of serving communities, but you have something really special here. And I think it's really important what you're doing, not just for your city. What you're doing is for the world, and that's a gift. And so continue to press into this. A lot of it may seem undramatic, but it's important. And the work that you're doing as a community is crucial. It's crucial to heal the world, and it's crucial to heal the body of Christ that's so divided. So this evening, I want to talk a little bit about what healing the world could look like through rooting our spirituality in a way that facilitates and nurtures the possibility of freedom. So for a little context, my wife and I spent 20 years living and working all over the world. We were part of an international community that had projects in about 15 cities in Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, West Africa, and all over South America. And we were working with children that lived and worked on the streets. We were working with families who were impacted by the global AIDS pandemic. So a lot of kids who were orphaned because of AIDS, and a lot of children who were born HIV positive. And then we did a lot of work that sort of helped little kids and women who had been trafficked into the commercial sex industry find freedom. And so the anti-trafficking work, that work with kids that lived and worked on the streets, the work with families impacted by AIDS, and then a lot of work with children who were conscripted to fight in civil wars, was really for us an attempt to bear witness to hope. And what I mean when I say bear witness to hope is that we actually know that we live in a world that has legitimate reasons to question the possibility of a good God. A lot of us, actually, I imagine in your city, imagine in the areas where you live, a lot of your neighbors probably continue to pray prayers that go unanswered. And it's not because God doesn't hear these prayers, and because it seems that these prayers aren't being answered, that's not an indictment against the possibility of the goodness of God, but it probably says something about us, right? The body of Christ. And so we actually made that audacious option to continue to believe that God was good. And so as communities, we sort of rooted ourselves in places of deep pain and deep poverty, and we bore witness to that. And it was it was a huge gift to be included in that community, and it was really an honor to be able to do that work. But you can imagine, that work came with a cost, and the toll was something that we absorbed in our bodies, in our minds, and really in our souls. At the 20th anniversary of that organization, we put together a list of the women and kids that we had worked with that hadn't lived to sort of celebrate 20 years with us. And that list was over 700 names. Folks who died because of street violence, police violence, folks who died in red light districts, children who had died because of malnutrition and related diseases. It was overwhelming. And so if you can imagine that kind of work, and if you can imagine sort of a community that was really living among the dying, there are a few things that we sort of saw, and there's a few things that sort of caught up to us. And the first was that we did a better job of taking care of somebody else than we did ourselves. And imagine if you're a parent, if you're an educator, a social worker, if you're a healthcare professional, actually if you're just a sensible human being, you may also sort of find yourself guilty of doing that, of taking better care of someone else than you do yourselves. But we know this. We know that the scriptures tell us to love our neighbor as ourselves. And so some of us actually need to sort of relearn what it means to allow ourselves to be loved, to actually let ourselves be loved. And when we don't, there's a breakdown of credibility. There's an issue of integrity there. Right? Secondly, we saw a lot of amazing young people say yes to these, I think, very difficult but compelling vocations of hope. And so they'd move to places like India or Nepal or Thailand, or they'd move into the favelas in Brazil, only to sort of turn over every 18 months, 2 years, 3 years. And you know this. You know that if we really want to make lasting change in some of these places, it requires commitment. It requires solidarity. It requires really moving in, rooting ourselves. And so we saw people have this inability to practice stability. And that was really detrimental to their witness, right? So we were taking better care of someone else than we were ourselves. We couldn't practice stability. And then third, we saw all these great people say yes, only to sort of burn out, to do it at their own expense, to use the best of themselves up. And that was tragic. And those of us who didn't completely burn out sort of teetered on the edge, perpetually teetering on the edge of burnout. And nobody wants to live that way. We made this mistake. We thought that community would sustain our vocations. But you know this, community is transitionatory. We come and we go, and it's dynamic. And we found that a lot of the hard work we were doing was trying to maintain community. What we had to discover, the sort of hard lesson we had to learn, was that community is an incubator for our vocational imaginations, but it was the contemplative that rooted us. It was the contemplative that allowed us to move from merely sustaining in our vocations to thriving. And I think we all want that, right? I don't want a sustainable marriage. That'd be sort of a bummer. I want my marriage to be dynamic and alive, and I want it to grow. So when we saw these folks sort of burn out or teeter on the edge of burnout, we saw a lot of them leave, and we saw a lot of them leave community. And it's bad. You know how this is. We are the Christians, we're the worst at transitions. We don't leave well. We don't let people leave well. And not only did people leave community poorly, but some of them actually sort of, in the worst situations, walked away from their faith. Now, I can understand this, the things that we were seeing, the people that we were working with, the neighborhoods that we were in, pretty terrible places. And like I said, we were bearing witness to hope that God is still good. And so when people sort of gave up, I don't have the sense that they actually walked away from their faith. I have the sense that their beliefs no longer worked. And I think that's probably true for a lot of us. Our beliefs don't have good answers for the suffering that we see in the world. Our beliefs actually aren't going to hold up. And so we need to make this movement, right? From belief to faith. And faith is making an option for the absurd. Faith is putting our hope in something that's unbelievable. Now look, belief is important, and belief is the scaffolding on the way to faith. And we need our beliefs. We grow up in our beliefs. But I grew up believing in Santa Claus when I was a little kid because adults I trusted told me Santa was real, because my peer group fortified it, and because every Christmas morning under the tree there was evidence of it. And I think a lot of us are that kind of Christian. We believe in God because adults we trusted told us this was real. Our peer group fortifies it, and we see the evidence. We know the evidence. Look, that's important. But you also know that at a certain point, moving from belief to faith is sort of a dismantling of us creating God in our image, of us trying to control our notions of the divine. So we began to make this journey, right? This journey from belief to faith, and we did that rooting ourselves in the contemplative, the historic contemplative Christian tradition. And when we talk about contemplative spirituality, we're talking about prayers and postures and ways of nurturing our spirituality that are marked by solitude, silence, and stillness. Right? And this isn't new. Actually, this is a gift of the early church fathers and mothers from Africa, if you guys sort of count North Africa as Africa. This is a gift that you've given to the church and really to the world. And so solitude. If you're in church this morning, you probably heard Felina talk about this a little bit. Solitude. Solitude, silence, and stillness, these are the overcorrections to the absurdities of our life. So solitude. Look, a lot of folks I know are always surrounded by friends, with people, going to the market together. They have 3 or 4 or 5 roommates. It's like we can never be alone anymore. And what's ironic, and actually what's really sad about that, is some of us are still really lonely. We're insulated. We're insulated in community, but we still don't feel seen, understood, named. And so solitude. Solitude actually teaches us to be present. And it teaches us to be present to God who's among us, within us. It teaches us to be present to ourselves. It teaches us to be present to each other. Silence. Look, there's so much noise in our lives. I walk around with my phone, and I'm sad to confess this. If we had coffee or lunch, it'd probably be on the table between us because I'm addicted. I'm addicted to the digital distractions. I'm addicted to the notifications. I can hardly listen without being distracted. But silence teaches us to listen. It teaches us to hear the voice of God that calls you the beloved son or daughter. It teaches you to listen to the voice within you. The voice that gives you the ability to make the decisions that come from the wisdom of your body, the ability to practice discernment. And then stillness. Look, in 2015, I know more activists. I know more people who are cause-driven. I know more people who want to build a better world and live in a better world than I've ever known in my life. And basically, for 25 years, I've been a professional activist. This is great. It's great that we have the social consciousness to do good in the world. It's great that we have the social consciousness for reconciliation, for peace building, for healing the things that divide us. But you know this, you know that even in our best intentions and our best efforts, there are still unintended harmful consequences. We leave a wake behind us of our short-sightedness, of our ego-driven ability to actually try to build a better world, because actually a lot of us are actually working our own pain out in places of pain. And that's a new kind of exploitation. A lot of us want these intense ministry, outreach, mission experiences. And so we go into the slum communities, we go into the red light areas. And you know what we do? We do this as almost a form of religious voyeurism, Christian tourism, using the suffering of someone else for our own personal formation and discipleship. And that is a terrible way to exploit somebody who's already lost everything. And so stillness actually teaches us what engagement can and should look like. Right? So solitude, silence, and stillness, these are the overcorrections for the absurdities in our lives. And we resist it because it's painful to be alone, because it torments our mind to sometimes be quiet, and we can hardly stop moving without becoming anxious. But in solitude, silence, and stillness, and in nurturing this contemplative spirituality, there are amazing gifts that come forward. There are amazing discoveries, and there's amazing things that we receive about ourselves, about God, that none of us could probably ever imagine. And so I want to sort of talk about one of those gifts. And we can sort of speculate what the sort of low-hanging fruits of the contemplative are in our lives. And we know that these are peace and acceptance, and we know that these are centeredness, and we can name those, right? But I want to really talk tonight about the gift of freedom, and what the gift of freedom means for us, and what the gift of freedom means for our community. So if you take notes and you need to sort of have the outline, here's the outline. I want to talk a little bit about reclaiming our identity. I want to talk about making peace with our shadow, and then I want to talk about claiming the gifts of those around us. Right? So if you got to bounce, that's what I'm going to say. If you want to stick around for 10 more minutes, I'll sort of try to tease these out, right? And I want to tease these out in story from some friends of ours who live in a neighborhood in Calcutta, India. I lived in India for several years. When I was younger, I did a lot of work with Mother Teresa, and then I did a lot of work with kids who are HIV positive. And then we began to do some work in Calcutta in the red light areas. And so there's this neighborhood, it's called Sonagachi, and it's 2 blocks long, and in these 2 blocks, they say there's nearly 12,000 women and children, and many of them have been trafficked from places like Burma, Bangladesh, and rural parts of North and Northeast India. It took our community 7 years to get into the neighborhood, right? Because in India, if you're 16 years or older, prostitution is legalized, but of course, because so many of the kids and the women in this neighborhood were trafficked, the brothel owners and the pimps sort of needed to protect their business interests, and so it's very difficult, right? Then at both ends of this this neighborhood, there are police officers. And the corruption is unfortunate because the police officers actually are there to sort of protect the interests of the brothel owners and some of the pimps. And so as our community members, as our staff members are trying to get into the neighborhood, it was almost at their own peril. And in some instances, we were threatened by these folks, knives to our throats. We were locked in brothel rooms. But after 7 years, the Union of Commercial Sex Workers finally let us in. And so when they let us in, we began to meet with some of the women, having tea, sitting on the sidewalk, playing with their children when the women weren't working. And we began to ask this question: what does freedom look like for you? And you know this if you've done any sort of mission work or outreach, that the best thing that we can do is support the vision of those that we care about rather than imposing ours on them. Because we know that the resources for freedom always exist within the person who yearns for it. And so we listened. We asked the question. And these ladies, they wanted to change this cycle of poverty. They wanted to change this cycle of exploitation for their children. Because in a neighborhood like this, when kids are old enough for sex, sadly, they are often prostituted out, and even sadder, many cases by their own parent or parents. And so these women, just like any sensible parent, didn't want their kids to have to suffer in the ways that they suffered. And so they put their kids first. They put their children first. And they said, our freedom, it looks like making something beautiful, telling a story of our own restoration. And so the idea came forward that they would begin to make these really, really pretty quilts, these big, big blankets, scarves, right, purses. And they were to stitch these products out of old, ratty, used up, discarded saris, right? Sari, the traditional dress worn by many Indian women. And that was important. It was important that we were taking material that was discarded, that was used up, that was thrown away, because that's how some of the women felt. They felt dirty. They felt worthless. And in taking that material and not only making something beautiful, but making something valuable, there's a story of restoration even in that, right? It's incredible. So we did this work, and it was, it just took off. Like, we just found such momentum there. And the women were really excited, and so we began these community centers where very faithfully, very undramatically, very quietly, in this very sort of contemplative process and posture, they would stitch these beautiful, beautiful blankets all day long. Well, a friend of ours, I don't know if we sang any of his songs today at your church. A friend of ours is a songwriter named Chris Tomlin. And Chris Tomlin and some of the guys that he sings and works with had helped us. They had helped us raise a lot of money for freedom, right? And so we'd invest the money in the neighborhoods, we'd create jobs, we'd sell these products all over the world, and then all the profits from the products went back into the community centers, into freedom, creating more jobs. It was incredible. So we're really grateful for Chris and these guys, and all the work that they had done, the advocacy work, the fundraising work. And Chris Tomlin was coming through town. We live in Omaha, Nebraska, and we grabbed lunch with him. We gave him a blanket, one of the blankets the women made. We just said, man, we can't express how deeply grateful we are for the advocacy work that you're doing, really. And as we gave him the blanket, we wanted to tell him a story about the blankets. So, you probably know this. If you've ever had to work in the adult entertainment industry, if any of you have ever prostituted or been forced to prostitute, or if you have friends who work in the commercial sex industry, you know that one of the psychological coping mechanisms of folks who've experienced prolonged sexual abuse and trauma is disassociation, right? So if you know friends who dance or prostitute or work, you know that usually when they're at work, they go by a different name, right? And this is sort of, there's different reasons for this, but one of the reasons, sort of the subconscious sort of leads in this, is that when the abuse and the assault is coming at you, when it's coming at these women, these kids, they want to protect something inside themselves, and so they project this alter alias, this alter ego, this other name, so that that person, that idea of an identity can receive some of that pain. And this is a way of protecting ourselves. And I know we all sort of protect ourselves in different ways, but as you can imagine, a lot of the women in this red light area were going by names. They were going by names when they weren't. And so one afternoon, our project director was sitting in the community center. She was holding up one of these blankets, and she was a professionally, classically trained artist. And she said, you know, every one of these blankets is beautiful like a piece of art. And you know what artists do when they're proud of their work? They sign it. And so she said, as you finish your scarves, your purses, your blankets, I want to get these really gorgeous, professionally stitched tags, name tags, that you can put on your work, that you can take pride in what you're doing, right? So that it would say, made in India by Prabha, made in India by Supriya, made in India by Rupa. And so she said, I'm going to send this piece of paper around, and I want you all to sort of scribble the name down that you want your tags to say. So all the women sort of got quiet for a quick second and sort of looked at each other, because a lot of these women had been working in the neighborhood for 5, 10, 15 years, and many of them had never even shared with their friends their real name. But I think in one of the most beautiful eruptions of grace that I've ever heard, almost every single one of the women brought forward the name that their mothers gave them when they were baby girls. It was profound, right? It was incredible. Our name, right? Who are we? So we told Chris Tomlin this. We gave him the blanket, and then he invited me to the show he was doing that night, and it was in this huge arena. It was crazy, and thousands of people. And actually, halfway through the show, he sort of stopped the music. The band walked off the stage, and it was just him and his mic stand. He set the guitar down, and he started to tell the story of this community of women, and he started to tell the story of this project. And it was actually really moving, and I was sitting in the back there, and I was just like, whoa, this is crazy. And then one of the guys in the band ran out and handed him the blanket that we had given him over lunch, and he was holding up the blanket, and then he started to tell the story of these women reclaiming their names, bringing forward their identities. And I was actually starting to get a little emotional. And then he started to look on this blanket, and he said, in this blanket was made by, and he found the tag, and he said, a woman named Mukti. And then I just lost it. It was like, oh my God, this woman has been called horrible things. She has been locked down in a little tiny room in a brothel for longer than she can remember. And she probably has no idea of a space this large with this many people speaking of her with such honor. And so after the show, I went back to my office. It was late in Omaha. It was early in India, and I called them up, and I just said, y'all have friends here. There's people on your side. They're praying for you. They're standing with you. And I said, and tell Mukti, he held her blanket up. And the project director on the other side of the phone said, that's amazing. She said, do you know what Mukti means? Turns out that Mukti means freedom. Right? Can you imagine a woman trafficked into prostitution, locked down, hiding behind an alias for most of her adult life, finally bringing forward the gift of her name, freedom? Can you find a better totem actually for a story like that? I was overwhelmed. And I think for some of us, this is the invitation, right? In the contemplative, we find who we are, and our true identities come forward. Now, this is hard. This is really hard work for some of us, because we've over-identified ourselves with the fragments that make up the whole. And so some of us over-identify with our gifts, our successes, our education, our professions. Some of us actually over-identify with the ways that we've been hurt or wounded. And sadly, a lot of us probably over-identify ourselves with our failures or our mistakes. And we lead with that over-identification of one of these fragments. And that's who we actually think we are. But we know the fragments aren't the whole. We know these aliases, these false identities that we lead with are actually lies that we're telling ourselves and lies that we're telling each other. And so I think for some of us, we need to find our name again. And I think for some of us, your name is free. I think for some of you, your name is loved. I think for some of you, your name is forgiven, and you need to receive that. So one afternoon, I'm sitting in one of these community centers with these ladies, and I was looking at one of the blankets they had finished. And you know, every single one of these blankets that they make, there's these little patches, right? Some of them are like the size of a postage stamp, and some of them are the size of our phone. And every blanket has a series of patches all over. And I was just sort of like, man, this is sort of cool. Like, this is sort of like an artistic sort of expression. Like, the woman sort of puts her fingerprints on her art, and she just makes these things pop. And so as I was mentioning this, one of the guys that worked in the co-op just sort of looked at me and he started laughing, and some of the ladies were rolling their eyes at me. And my friend Upendra goes, brother, he goes, actually, because we're using ratty, used up, recycled material, every sari comes in with flaws and tears. And it takes some of these women 3 or 4 days to actually make a really beautiful blanket. And then after it's washed, it goes through quality control before it's shipped. And he said, in every single one of these blankets, after it's washed and dried, we find the tears, we find the holes, we find the flaws. And so the women have to actually go back over and patch these blankets. And they hate it. They hate the patchwork because it's tedious. And actually, in some instances, it takes longer to actually patch a blanket than to sew a blanket. And I sat there and I thought about that for a second. Because it's the patches that make those blankets beautiful. And the second thing I want to sort of suggest tonight is it's the patches that make us beautiful. It's our flaws that make us who we are. And one of our teachers, Richard Rohr, says that everything belongs, and some of us need to actually learn to receive the gift of that. You see, we need to make this movement from woundedness to brokenness. And what I mean when I say woundedness is that's one of the shared conditions of our humanity. We all have been hurt by someone, by ourselves. Maybe there was an adult that harmed you as a child. Maybe you fell in love with this super cute girl or this hip and sassy dude, and they just didn't return the love. Or maybe actually your marriage ended in a way that you didn't want it to. Look, all of us have these wounds, and we carry these wounds with us. And that is one of the gifts of our humanity. But we know this. We know that woundedness and brokenness are different, because brokenness is the voluntary surrender of these wounds to the will of God, to the love of God. And in our brokenness, these wounds have actually the possibility to heal. Now look, when the wounds are healed, that doesn't mean we forget them. In fact, there's scars, and that scar tissue is a reminder of the grace. That scar tissue is a reminder of the struggle. But that move from woundedness to brokenness is what makes us beautiful. It's the patches that make us beautiful. It's the receiving of grace and the living into the possibility of what that grace means that make you who you are, that fortify the truth of your identity, and that allows that to come forward. And so the last thing I want to say is that it's the community that we're a part of that sort of is the midwife for these gifts to come forward. So one afternoon, these ladies were sitting around and they were telling each other stories, right? I was trafficked from this village, and I was trafficked from that village, and the traffickers came to my family and they promised me this work, and the traffickers came to my family and made a marriage proposal. And as they began to hear each other's stories, what they actually began to hear was a resonance, similar stories. And they began to realize that it was the same guys who had trafficked many of these ladies with the same tricks and the same lies. And so as you can imagine, these ladies were getting angry. And then they were getting protective of the villages that they came from and the little girls in their own communities. And so this great idea emerged to start prevention units. And so the women went back to their villages and they began to meet with folks in their community saying, hey, this is what happened to us, and I'm afraid this could happen to some of your daughters. And so let us help, right? So they began to identify the profiles of the young girls who would be vulnerable to the traffickers. And what they did was they invited them in to these community centers so that during the mornings, these kids learned for the first time in their lives to read and write. And then in the afternoons, they were taught to stitch, sort of marketable skills so that they could earn money for themselves and their families. It's amazing, right? This is a great idea. So one afternoon, I'm sitting in one of the prevention units, and I'm sitting across from this girl. She's probably 14 or 15 years old, and she's hilarious. And she finished a blanket, and she began to stitch the name tag on the blanket. And the name tag she stitched on the blanket was Mukti. And I knew her name wasn't Mukti, so I was like, what's up? And the project manager there said, hey, every girl in the prevention units signs their name with Mukti. And I thought, what an amazing statement. That girls who've never been trafficked, that girls who've never been locked down, the girls who've never been enslaved, claim the gift of freedom, claim the identity of the women who've gone before them. They stand on their shoulders, and they live into the possibility of what their community has struggled for. And that's our invitation, right? Some of us don't earn what we receive, because in our relationships here and our friendships here, with our mentors, our teachers, our pastors, our guides. We receive the gifts of the community that has gone before us. And so look, if you're a younger person, there's some wise elders in this room that you need to learn from. And for some of us who are a little bit older, we actually need to be inspired and led by the energy of some of these young folks who have an idea for what a new, better world can become. But that's the gift that comes from being part of something like this, right? So the contemplative, right? Nurturing our spirituality with practices marked by solitude, silence, and stillness allows for our identities to come forward, allows for us to make peace with who we are, the good and the bad, and allows us to receive the gifts of those around us. And I'm going to close with a story to sort of illustrate that. So I meet with this older Jesuit guy, this crusty old Irish priest. And he's a son of a gun. And it's amazing. It's been 8 or 9 years now of just really being sort of graciously pressed into the contemplative, pressed into sort of the mess of myself, and pressed into the possibility of what God wants to do in my life, through my life, in my community. And so I went on a retreat with my spiritual director, Father Larry Gillick, and he told us this story, that he was visiting an elementary school, right? Catholic school, and he was talking to a 3rd grade girl. And as he was speaking with her, in mid-conversation, she realized that Father Gillick was unable to see. So she just blurted it out in surprise. "You're blind." And Father Gillick, this is true, when he was an 8-year-old boy, he lost his sight, sort of bent down in front of her, and he's like, that's not a surprise to me. And before he could say anything else, she went from astonishment to deep sadness. And she said, "You don't know what you look like." And then she said, "You're beautiful." Look, that's our story. We're blind. We don't know our identity. We don't know what we look like because we've over-identified ourselves with the fragments. But we're beautiful. And sometimes it takes the so-called unlikely other in our community to name what is true in us. God loves you more than you want to be loved. God is not as hard on you as you are on yourself. And God wants to use you more than you want to be used. I'm going to pray that for us now. And so, our God, we come to you this evening with hearts that are open. We ask that you would give us the courage to press into solitude, silence, and stillness. We ask that you would give us the grace to receive the gifts that come from this. And we ask that as your kingdom comes among us, and as we are transformed, the world we're a part of will be transformed, rooted in a deep contemplative posture that brings forward the gifts of peace, hope, healing. May we be truthful about our identities. May we make peace with our shadows, and may we press into this community. We pray these things in all of your beautiful names, our Creator, our Divine Parent, our loving God. Amen.
Chris, thanks so much for what you shared, and thank you for your life. Thank you for the gift.